During shopping, my 8-year-old clutched my hand and said, "Mom, quickly, to the bathroom." In the stall, she whispered, "Don't move. Look front." I hid and froze in horror. I didn't cry. I took action. 3 hours later, my mother-in-law went pale because she realized her game was over. Through the gap beneath the metal door, I saw polished black shoes stop directly in front of us. A man's voice, low and rhythmic, spoke into his phone. He described Abby's new blue dress. The air in the cramped stall turned thick and metallic. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled Abby closer. Her small frame trembling against my side. The stranger outside paced slowly. He hummed a tuneless melody that set my teeth on edge. This was not a chance encounter. He was checking the stalls one by one, looking for the specific shopping bags resting against my knees. He knew exactly what we had purchased 10 minutes ago. He was hunting us. I reached into my pocket with numb fingers and pulled out my phone. Working double shifts in the emergency room taught me that documentation is survival. I hit the record button and held the device toward the floor. The stranger stopped again. He was breathing heavily now, the sound echoing off the sterile white tiles. "I have them pinned," he whispered into his receiver. My skin went cold as I realized he wasn't alone. Someone was waiting for us at the mall exit. I didn't scream for help. Instead, I sent a silent text to the local precinct and mall security. I watched the black shoes pivot away toward the sinks. When the bathroom door hissed shut, I grabbed Abby and ran. We bypassed the main concourse and ducked into the security office. The guard looked at my frantic face and the recording on my screen. His skeptical expression vanished instantly. On the monitor, we watched the man in the suit. He looked like an ordinary professional. The police intercepted the man near the fountain. He didn't run or struggle. He simply smiled and flashed a private investigator's badge. "I am Brian Hartman," he said smoothly. "I am conducting a legal welfare check for a client." My stomach dropped as the lead officer handed me the man's intake form. The name at the bottom was Margaret Louise Miller. My mother-in-law had been paying this man to stalk us for weeks. She wanted evidence of neglect to take my daughter away. The precinct lights were harsh as I stared at the folder of photos. There were images of us at the park and my hospital parking lot. Then Mike walked through the doors, looking breathless and worried. He reached for Abby, but she pulled back, hiding behind my coat. "How did you know we were here, Mike?" I asked quietly. He fumbled for an answer, his eyes darting toward the detective. He had been the one feeding Margaret our daily schedule. The betrayal tasted like ash. Mike stood frozen under the buzzing precinct lights. His hands hovered in mid-air, twitching with a nervous energy I had never noticed before today. "I only wanted to help," he stammered. His voice sounded thin and brittle like dry glass. I looked down at Abby, whose grip on my sleeve remained ironclad. She watched her uncle with a new, sharp suspicion. The detective leaned back, tapping a pen against the thick surveillance file. Mike finally lowered his gaze. I stepped closer, forcing him to meet my eyes. "Helping usually involves the truth, Mike." He winced at my tone. The air in the room felt heavy with the smell of floor wax and stale coffee. He tried to reach out again, but I pivoted away. My nursing scrubs felt like a lead weight against my skin. He looked at the detective, then back at me. "She said you were drowning, Lauren." It was a classic Margaret lie. The detective opened the folder and slid a photograph across the laminate table. It showed me sitting on a park bench, head in my hands, while Abby played nearby. It looked like a portrait of defeat, not a moment of quiet reflection. "Is this what she wanted?" I asked. My voice remained steady despite the roar in my ears. Mike nodded slowly, his face crumpling. He had been the one to tell her when I felt weakest. We walked toward the exit as the rain began to lash against the station windows. The parking lot was a sea of gray asphalt and flashing blue lights. Mike followed us like a ghost, his shadow long and jagged. I didn't know about the investigator. He whispered into the wind. I didn't stop or turn. I just kept walking toward my old SUV. I needed to get Abby home. I needed to lock every single door tonight. Just as I reached the car, a black sedan pulled into the adjacent spot. The window rolled down to reveal Margaret's perfectly styled hair and cold, calculating eyes. She didn't look like a grieving grandmother. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. She didn't even acknowledge the police officers standing nearby. She just looked at Abby and smiled a thin, bloodless smile. I am just worried about the child's environment, she said. Her entitlement felt like a physical blow. I didn't argue or shout. I simply held up the temporary protective order the detective had handed me minutes earlier. Margaret's smile vanished instantly. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened, until her knuckles turned white. She looked at Mike, expecting him to defend her, but he stood silent in the rain. He finally saw the monster he had been feeding. The power dynamic shifted in a single, silent heartbeat. Margaret realized she had lost her inside man. We got into the car and drove away without looking back at them. Abby stared out the window at the passing streetlights. Mom. Is Grandma Maggie going to jail? She asked softly. I reached over and squeezed her hand. I didn't have a perfect answer for her yet. As we pulled into our driveway, I noticed something strange. A small, familiar toy sat on our front porch. It was a plush character Mike had bought yesterday. I realized then he must have kept the spare key David once gave him for emergencies. The plush toy sat like a small sentinel on the dark porch. Skin prickled as I stared at the bright fabric. I knew for a fact the door had been locked. I reached for my keys, but my hands shook. Abby stayed close to my side, her breath hitching in the cold night air. I pushed the door open and stepped into the entryway. The house smelled faintly of wood smoke and Mike's expensive cologne. He was inside. I moved toward the kitchen, my boots heavy on the hardwood floor. Mike was sitting at the table, a spare key glinting under the overhead light. He didn't look up as we entered. His shoulders were slumped, but his presence felt like an invasion. I told you I wasn't ready to talk, I said. My voice was a low warning. He finally raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot and tired. He looked truly broken. I had to make sure you were safe, Mike whispered. He slid the key across the table toward me. It made a sharp, scratching sound against the wood. I didn't pick it up. I stood my ground, keeping Abby behind the island. The tension in the room was a living thing. I saw a stack of papers near his elbow. They were copies of Margaret's bank statements. He had been digging into her secrets. He was finally fighting back. Mike pointed at the top page. She didn't just hire a PI, Lauren. My heart skipped a beat as I leaned over to look. The statements showed large, recurring payments to a local law firm. They specialized in grandparent rights and emergency custody. Margaret hadn't been planning a slow build. She was preparing for a total strike. She wanted Abby by the end of the month. The betrayal went deeper than a few photos. She had bought a legal army. I felt a surge of cold fury. This was my home, and they had turned it into a tactical map. I grabbed the papers and shoved them into my bag. Leave. Mike. Now. He stood up slowly, nodding in silent agreement. He seemed to understand that his presence was a reminder of my pain. He walked toward the door without another word. I watched him go, but I didn't feel relieved. The house felt smaller. The walls were closing in. I spent the next hour checking the window locks. I found a small electronic device tucked behind the bookshelf. It was a nanny cam I had never installed. Margaret had been watching us from the inside. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized our private moments were recorded. Every tear and every laugh had been cataloged for a judge. I disabled the camera and sat on the floor. I was no longer just a grieving widow. Abby came out of her room holding a small, old photograph. It was David at her age, grinning at the camera. "Is Grandma trying to turn us into ghosts?" she asked. Her voice was too old for her years. I pulled her into my lap and held her tight. I realized then that Margaret's plan had a massive flaw. She had forgotten that David loved me more than his own mother. I found a hidden note tucked behind the picture frame. I unfolded the yellowed scrap of paper with trembling fingers. David's handwriting was unmistakable, jagged and hurried. It was a list of passwords for a secure cloud drive I never knew existed. He had titled it, "Insurance." My chest tightened as I realized he had been tracking Margaret's interference long before the accident. He knew his mother's nature better than anyone. I looked at Abby, who was watching me with wide, expectant eyes. The air felt charged with a sudden, desperate hope. I opened my laptop and typed the characters with freezing hands. The screen flickered, revealing folders of recorded phone calls and scanned legal documents. David had documented Margaret's previous attempts to meddle in our finances and medical decisions. He had built a digital fortress to protect us from his own blood. One folder was labeled with the current date, 2 years ahead. I clicked it, my breath catching. Inside were audio files of Margaret discussing her long-term Abby project. The first recording played, filling the quiet kitchen with Margaret's sharp, clinical tone. She was speaking to her lawyer about Lorne's instability. Mere weeks after the funeral, she sounded cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of grief. It was a blueprint for a kidnapping disguised as a rescue. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a burning clarity. She hadn't just started this. She had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The hunt was her life's work. I realized I needed to get this data to the detective immediately. I began downloading the files onto a thumb drive. The progress bar crawled with agonizing slowness. Every creak of the house made me jump. I looked at the nanny cam I had dismantled earlier. If she had been watching, she knew I had found the drive. I grabbed my car keys and signaled for Abby to put on her shoes. We couldn't stay in this house tonight. We reached the front door when a shadow blocked the porch light. I froze, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. A heavy knock echoed through the wood, vibrating in my teeth. It wasn't Mike's gentle rhythm. This was a forceful, demanding sound. I looked through the peephole and saw Hartman standing there. He wasn't wearing his suit anymore. He looked disheveled and frantic. He held a legal envelope against the glass. He had been sent to finish the job. "Open up, Lauren," Hartman shouted. His voice was muffled but thick with desperation. "You need to sign these or things get much worse." I backed away from the door, pulling Abby into the shadows. I knew he had no legal right to be there. The protective order was already in the system. He was acting outside the law now. I saw a second figure moving near the driveway. Margaret's car was idling at the curb. They were trying to corner us. I dialed the detective's direct line while retreating toward the back exit. My heart was a drum in my ears. "They're at my house," I whispered when he picked up. I heard the sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. They weren't waiting for a signature anymore. I grabbed Abby and ducked into the basement. As I locked the heavy cellar door, I saw a notification on my phone. Mike was calling from Margaret's house. He had found something worse. The basement air was cold and smelled of damp concrete. I held my breath. Listening to the heavy boots thudding against the floorboards directly above our heads. Hartman was moving toward the basement door with terrifying purpose. I ignored Mike's vibrating call and opened his latest text instead. It was a photo of a forged custody order. Margaret had created a fake document to justify a forced entry. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was coming to take Abby tonight. The door at the top of the stairs groaned under a sudden, violent kick. I looked around the dark room for a weapon. My hand closed around a heavy metal flashlight. Abby huddled in the corner behind a stack of winter tires. She didn't make a sound, her eyes reflecting the faint moonlight from a high window. The wood splintered with a sickening crack. Hartman was halfway through the door. I realized the police wouldn't arrive in time to stop him. I shoved the thumb drive into my pocket and grabbed a heavy crowbar from the workbench. I wasn't just a nurse or a widow anymore. I was a mother defending her cub. The door gave way and Hartman tumbled down the first few steps. He looked wild, his eyes bloodshot and his tie hanging loose. He held the forged papers out like a shield. "Give her to me, Lauren," he hissed. I stepped into the dim light, raising the iron bar. Hartman stopped, his confidence wavering as he saw the steel in my gaze. He didn't expect me to fight back. "The police are 3 minutes away," I said. My voice was like ice. I could hear Margaret screaming from the driveway. Her voice high and unstable. She was losing control of her professional hunter. Hartman looked at the high, narrow window and then back at me. He realized his payday wasn't worth a prison sentence. He began to retreat. The sound of sirens finally cut through the night air, growing louder with every second. Hartman turned and scrambled back up the stairs, fleeing into the dark house. I didn't chase him. I ran to Abby and pulled her into a tight embrace. We stayed on the cold floor, listening to the chaos above. There were shouts, the sound of boots on gravel, and then the sharp, authoritative bark of the police. The house was crawling with blue uniforms. Detective Miller found us 10 minutes later. He looked exhausted, his coat wet from the driving rain. He helped us up and led us out of the basement. Hartman was already in handcuffs near the kitchen island. Margaret was sitting in the back of a cruiser. Her face pressed against the glass. She looked small and defeated. "We found the forgeries in Hartman's bag," the detective said. He took the thumb drive from my shaking hand. We stood on the lawn as the tow truck arrived for Margaret's car. Mike pulled into the driveway, his face pale and eyes red. He walked toward us, but the police blocked his path. I signaled for them to let him through. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the broken front door. "I found her original notes," he whispered. He handed me a leather journal. I opened it and saw David's name crossed out in red ink. I stared at the red ink striking through David's name. The leather journal felt cold in my hands. Margaret's handwriting was tight and precise. She had treated my husband's life like a line item in a budget. Mike stood back, his face shadowed by the revolving police lights. He looked like a man who had finally seen the bottom of a deep well. I flipped a page and found a section titled Replacement. It was a detailed plan to rewrite Abby's entire history. The detective gently took the journal from my hands. He signaled for another officer to take Mike's statement. I watched my brother-in-law walk toward the cruiser, his head bowed. He wasn't the enemy, but he was a bridge. Margaret had used his grief to cross into our lives. I pulled my coat tighter against the wind. The broken glass of the kitchen window crunched under a medic's boot. This house was no longer a home. It was a crime scene. We were moved to the precinct for the final processing. The air inside smelled of ozone and cheap industrial soap. I sat on a hard plastic chair, with Abby sleeping against my shoulder. Across the room, Margaret sat behind a glass partition. She looked older than she had an hour ago. Her poise had vanished, replaced by a frantic, twitching energy. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at Abby with a hunger that made my skin crawl. Hartman was being led down the hall in chains. He stopped for a second, looking at me with a strange expression. It wasn't anger, it was a realization of his own stupidity. He had risked everything for a woman who was clearly unraveling. "She told me you were the one who broke the law," he muttered. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. The digital drive in the detective's hand was all the evidence I would ever need. The lead detective returned with a coffee and a grim look. He sat down and opened a new file on his desk. "We found something else in the PI's car," he said. He slid a small, silver locket across the table. My breath caught in my throat. It was David's locket, the one he wore every single day. It had been missing since the night of the crash. Margaret hadn't just been stalking us. She had been holding onto pieces of the dead. I touched the cold metal with a shaking finger. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had been at the crash site before the police arrived. She had taken things from the wreckage. She had been building her case against me since the moment David's heart stopped beating. The level of premeditation was staggering. She didn't want to help Abby. She wanted to possess the only part of David she could still control. I felt a sudden, sharp nausea. Mike appeared in the doorway, looking as though he might collapse. He saw the locket and his face went completely white. "She told me she lost that," he whispered. His voice was a thin, ragged thread. He walked to the table and sank into a chair. He finally understood the depth of his mother's illness. He wasn't just a pawn. He was a witness to a lifetime of quiet, domestic horror. He looked at me with a desperate, silent apology. I stood up, holding the locket tight in my palm. I needed to leave this place and never look back. The detective nodded, giving me permission to take Abby home. We walked past the holding cells, the sound of my boots echoing on the linoleum. Margaret stood up and pressed her hands against the glass as we passed. She didn't say a word, but her mouth moved in a silent prayer. Or maybe it was a curse. I didn't care. We reached the exit and stepped out into the pre-dawn light. The rain had stopped, leaving the world shimmering and cold. Mike followed us out, stopping at the edge of the sidewalk. "I'm going to my sister's," he said. His voice was stronger now, decided. He was cutting the cord. I looked at him and saw the man David had loved. He was flawed, but he was human. I gave him a small, wary nod of understanding. As I buckled Abby into her seat, my phone buzzed with a final notification. It was an automated alert from my home security system. The front door had just been closed and locked by a remote user. I looked at the screen and saw Margaret's secondary access code. She had set a timer to lock me out of my own house while I was at the station. Even from a jail cell. She was trying to dictate where I could sleep. I stared at the phone screen, the lockout notification glowing like a threat. Margaret had managed to strike from within a holding cell. My house was sealed, and the code I usually use was now useless. Abby was fast asleep in the back seat, unaware that we were technically homeless. I looked at the dark dashboard, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I refused to let Margaret win another round. I put the car in gear and drove toward the only other option left. I remembered a local locksmith, a man David had known for years, who specialized in high-security overrides. He lived in a small apartment above his shop near the river. I pounded on the door until a light flickered on upstairs. He looked at my frantic face and the sleeping child in the car. He didn't ask for an explanation or a work order. He just grabbed his heavy tool bag and jumped into his truck. We drove back to my house in a silent, desperate convoy. The rain began to fall again. We reached the driveway, and the locksmith went to work on the smart lock. I stood in the yard, watching the red light on the security camera blink. It felt like Margaret's eye was still watching me from miles away. The lock finally clicked open with a satisfying metallic snap. I stepped inside and immediately went to the master control panel. I initiated a hard factory reset on the entire system. I felt a surge of triumph as the red light finally turned a steady, peaceful green. I carried Abby up to her bed and tucked her in tightly. The house felt quiet. But it was a heavy, artificial silence. I walked back downstairs and began the grim task of reclaiming my space. I gathered every hidden camera I had found and threw them into a plastic bin. I wanted them out of my sight. My hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, clinical anger. I was a nurse, and I knew how to cut out an infection. I started with the kitchen, I found a small, leather-bound notebook tucked behind the microwave. It wasn't the journal Mike had given me earlier. This was a ledger of local contacts Margaret had cultivated over the last year. There were names of neighbors, teachers, and even a librarian. She had built a network of unwitting spies to report on my every move. I felt a chill as I realized how deep the roots of her obsession went. She had turned my entire community against me, without saying a single word. I sat at the kitchen table and began calling the names on the list. Most people hung up the moment they realized who was calling. They had been told I was unstable and dangerous. Margaret had painted a masterpiece of character assassination. I reached a neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who finally stayed on the line. "She said you were neglecting the girl," the woman whispered. Her voice was thick with guilt. I explained the recording and the private investigator. The silence on the other end was absolute. The power dynamic was shifting as the truth began to circulate through the neighborhood. I sent digital copies of the PI's confession to the school board and the local watch group. I was dismantling Margaret's influence brick by brick. By dawn, the ledger was a list of apologies instead of reports. I felt a sense of relief, but it was short-lived. I found a final entry at the very back of the book. It was a local bank account number I didn't recognize. I looked up the account and found it was a trust fund in Abby's name. Margaret had been funneling her late husband's life insurance into it for months. But there was a catch hidden in the fine print. The funds were only accessible if Abby was in the legal custody of a paternal relative. It was the financial motive for the entire hunt. She wasn't just after the girl. She was after the money David had left behind for his daughter's future. The greed was breathtaking. I realized then that Margaret's love was a transaction. She viewed Abby as a prize and a paycheck. I printed the bank records and added them to my growing pile of evidence. I heard a soft footstep on the stairs and looked up. Abby was standing there, holding her favorite blanket. "Is it over yet?" she asked. Her voice was small and hopeful. I walked over and knelt beside her. "Almost. Honey," I promised. "We're gonna be okay." I meant it. Just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, my doorbell rang. I checked the camera, expecting the police or Mike. Instead, a man in a dark suit was standing on the porch. He held a legal briefcase and looked incredibly nervous. He wasn't Hartman. He was a process server from a different firm. I opened the door, and he handed me a thick envelope. "You've been served," he said. Margaret had filed a civil suit for defamation from her cell. I stared at the thick envelope in my hand. Margaret was using her last remaining resources to drown me in legal fees. The defamation suit was a desperate smokescreen designed to stall the criminal proceedings. I didn't panic this time. I walked to the kitchen counter and laid the papers next to David's locket. The truth was no longer a hidden thing. I had the recordings and the bank statements. I was finally ready to face her in the light of day. The courthouse air was frigid and smelled of old paper. Margaret sat across the aisle, flanked by two expensive lawyers. She wore a modest gray suit and a look of practiced grief. She didn't look like a woman who had broken into a basement. She looked like a victim. My lawyer leaned in and whispered that the judge was known for being traditional. My heart sank. Margaret's facade was working. The room felt like a trap designed to favor the loudest lie. Then, the detective entered the room and handed a new file to the judge. It contained the final report from the forensic team. They had found the exact origin of the forged custody order. It had been created on Margaret's personal laptop 2 months ago. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to stern as he read the data. Margaret's lead lawyer went pale. The evidence of premeditated fraud was undeniable. The wall of lies was finally starting to crumble in public view. The judge looked at Margaret and asked for a direct explanation. She stammered, her voice losing its melodic grandmotherly quality. She tried to blame Hartman, but the paper trail led straight back to her bank account. I sat perfectly still, feeling the weight of the last 2 years lift. The lie that I was unfit was dead. I realized I didn't need to prove my worth to her anymore. I only needed to be present for my daughter. The hunt was over. We walked out of the courthouse an hour later. The sun was bright, reflecting off the damp pavement. Mike was waiting by the fountain, looking unsure of his place. I walked toward him and handed him David's locket. "He would want you to have this," I said. He took it with shaking hands. We weren't a perfect family, but we were a real one. The silence between us was no longer filled with secrets. We started walking together toward the car. Abby was waiting in the back seat, coloring a picture of a house with a tall fence. She looked up and smiled when she saw us. "Is it done?" she asked. I nodded and got into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, I noticed a small, white envelope tucked into the sun visor. I opened it and found a final letter from David. It was dated the morning of his accident. He had planned to leave her forever,